Hello everyone, welcome back to our Spring Boot series. Today I would like to talk about the lazy annotation. So we'll see what is this annotation and what is the impact of its use in our application, how does it work internally, where should we apply this annotation, so the advantages and trade-offs. Of course, it's something that it's related with software engineering. As you know, when you take a decision, you are taking a decision instead of another. Okay, so there is always advantage and somehow trade-offs when we do or when we make a choice. And then some common use cases where to use this annotation, and how does it work with other concepts like the scope of the bin, the type of the bin, and things like that. So what is lazy? Lazy is a Spring annotation that defers bin instantiation until its first access instead of application startup. Meaning when your application starts, Spring Boot will scan for bins. When you mark a bin as lazy, it will be scanned and something will happen. Usually, and most of the times, a proxy will be created. And then we'll see the details about it. But at the end of the day, you want to use lazy, spoiler alert, when you have initializations that can take a while, or you have some circular dependencies, and you want to defer for later the initialization of this bin, meaning you don't need it at the start of the application, you need it later. And then there are use cases where this is quite useful. Imagine that you have a bin that takes 5 minutes to initialize and you don't need that when your application starts. Maybe you want to start the application, making sure everything is work. So now when the bin will start to be necessary, that's when you want for that initialization to be done. So it can be applied at the class level, meaning you can put this annotation, let's say in parallel with the component, for instance, or service or REST controller, marks the bin itself as lazy initialized, or at the injection point, meaning if you have, let's say, users REST controller, and now you have user service, rather than put the lazy on the component service, you can put on the REST control in the constructor, meaning only inject this when when it will be necessary. So at the end of the day, it will be injected, but not the bin, but the proxy. So I can give you a spoiler alert. So because you might start to think, okay, but how can I call the constructor without the value? Because it's a required value. You usually Spring, when you have these kind of scenarios, always think that Spring creates proxies around most of the bins that you create. Okay, so injection point delays resolution of a dependency. Okay, delays the resolution, not injection. Okay, key mechanisms use CGL proxies or JDK dynamic proxies, meaning that when you use this annotation here, this bin, when it is injected in another class, it's not the bin that will be injected, but another class, which is a proxy that will be injected. And this proxy contains code that will understand when should the real bin be initialized. If you want to understand more, try to understand how the proxy pattern works. And if you don't understand how this pattern works, the proxy, please do it, because most of the Spring Boot use proxies everywhere. And if you don't understand the proxy pattern, you will never understand Spring Boot. So read about it. Maybe I already created a video about proxy. If it not, it will be sooner, because I'm creating a set of videos about patterns also. So in meantime, probably you should see a video about the proxy pattern. So how lazy works internally, you can see, let's see a kind of a flow. So you have a client, let's say a REST controller, and he wants a bin to access, for instance, service. So in this case, first it requests a lazy bin. And if it's a lazy bin, okay, the Spring will return to you a proxy instance, not the bin, but a class that passes as the bin. So you can inject this, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't have the business logic there. It's just a proxy. And now when you call the method, it will call the proxy method. But this proxy method, which use the same name as the real methods, will understand if he has to initialize or not the bin that is being proxified, let's say like that. If it was initialized earlier, so it will call the real method. Otherwise, it will call the initialization of this bin, inject it on the application context of Spring Boot, and calls the method. That's why we are deferring the execution and initialization for later. Okay, and then the for is just instantiate the real bin, of course, and delegate the method call. That's what I was trying to explain. So Spring injects a proxy instead of the actual objects, and the proxy delegates to the actual bin only when the method is called. So that's why If you have beans that takes a while to initialize or for other reasons, and you don't want to be initialized at the start, just use the lazy annotation. So advantages of using this annotation: improved startup performance. If you have beans that take a while, even seconds, it can be crazy because sometimes about just a few seconds. Okay, if you have, let's say, 50 beans like this one, it's not seconds, it starts to be minutes. And at some point you start to wonder, and it happened to me in some legacy projects that were migrating to Spring Boot. It took some of them minutes to initialize because they were connecting to external systems, and there are some timeouts. And since the beans, they were not lazy, at some point we started, maybe the application hang up, maybe something is wrong with the application, but it's not, it was just beans initializing. Okay, memory and CPU optimization. At the start, maybe we don't have to require all the CPU and memory if there are high level or high loading initializations. Break circular dependencies. I've talked about that in the past when I think created a bit of auto prototype. Sometimes you have beans A that depends on the beans B, and B depends on A, and this can happen a lot if you are not careful, if you are using interface on these beans. And one of the ways to, let's say, avoid the circular is just to put the lazy, because the lazy will create a circular, but at the same time it's not circular because one of the beans, it's the proxy, not the real one. So the real one will not call the other bin, meaning if imagine that GA, it's a bin that is initialized and the B is proxified. So it will be the proxy of B that will be injected on A. So A can depends on B, and B doesn't yet depends on A, only when it is real called. So when it is necessary, of course, if you are using the lazy. And useful in modular optional features. I mean, if you want to implement something like feature toggles and things like that, features that you want and sometimes you don't, or maybe you will need only them later. So lazy, it's also a good option. About the features that can go or not, I will talk in a moment why I said that. So trade-offs of lazy, there are some challenge, of course. First, use latency. The first scout to lazy bin has additional overhead because it's something that, okay, when you develop an application, we suppose intuitively that application initialize everything. So later, imagine that you have a bin that takes 5 minutes. Maybe after days the application started, at some point that bin that takes 5 minutes to initialize should be called, and it will take 5 minutes. And you should understand that this is just as expected and not a problem or a bug or an issue with the system that it's taking too much time in this call. Maybe it's the first call. The other ones will not take this time because it's already initialized. So be careful to document this and inform probably the DevOps team about that. Harder debugging, of course, because if it's not initialized, the code is not executed. So the constructor is not called. So when you're debugging at the start, maybe you want the code in the constructor to be initialized so you are sure about the current state of the application, but it will not, because only when it will be necessary to call the real method of this bin, the proxy will initialize the bin. So maybe you have this kind of async issues between what is expected and what is real happening. So, and possible overuse, if sometimes there is this naive thinking, which is, okay, maybe I can put everything lazy. So it's a good approach as a kind of a lazy loading pattern. Say, okay, I only load when it's necessary. Don't do that. You will inherit everything wrong about first use latency, harder debugging, and proxy complexity. That will be crazy. You don't want to go there. Just do to those things that are really in need of this approach to the behavior of the bins. So proxy complexity, in some scenarios, proxies may break reflection and expect-oriented expectations. That's because a reflection, it's to go to a specific class, and maybe you think that you are reflecting on your class, but you are reflecting on the proxy. Or the expect-oriented programming, which is a model in Spring Boot that you can find. It will generate code. It will work also with a lot of proxies, and it's kind of creating proxies of proxies. It's quite strange. So don't get surprised if something strange starts to happen when you do Java reflection and AOP operations on lazy bins. Okay, so be careful. So it's not that it's wrong, but you should take let's say a very careful approach to the code, and don't start to think, okay, it's a bug. Maybe it's not. It's just expected behavior because you're messing with proxies of proxies and things like that. Common use cases, external integrations, because it can take a while, timeouts and things like that. Something that is not in your control, something that happens outside your application. Every resource initialization, of course, PDF renderings, machine learning models, report generators. It's quite common. Maybe if you are using reports, you need reports later, not at the start of your application. Test support components for integration testing, conditional service, because some of the tests, maybe they will need a specific bin if they start to fail at some point. So in testing, it's quite useful to use the lazy to optimize the time in integration testing, not unit testing. Conditional services, load bins only if a feature toggle or property is enabled. It's quite good, meaning if I never use this feature, this bin will never be loaded. So let's see some examples. Admin panel features, it's quite common if you have classes about the admins, because usually if you think for a while, the administrators only use their features once in a while when there are new users and they have to do some intervention. Maybe 95% of the time there will be no admin intervention. So you can put these bins as lazy because it will be very rare when they are being used. Okay, that's one of the use cases. Another one is on demand. Report generator. When you're using an application, most of the times you are managing data. At some point you want to generate a report. So, and if imagine that you have a set of different types of reports that take a while to initialize. Maybe you want to check for specific files. Maybe you are using a Docker container that has the engine to execute the generation, and you have to initialize all these things. Maybe it's not a good idea to initialize these things at the start, but only when you need the first time to generate reports. Maybe you can do it sometimes asynchronously. You can say, okay, get this bin, load this bin. I'm now moving to that option. Even before you click the button to generate, you already initialize the bin. It depends how you develop your code. And of course, you can have optional SAML authentication. Just an example, sometimes there are applications, and when I start to talk about the Spring security, you will see that you can have multiple different application providers, and some of them can take a while to initialize, maybe just a few seconds, not hours or minutes. Others are quite fast. So it's just another example. If you don't use the SAML authentication provider, because usually it's more enterprise oriented, and maybe your website has a lot of users, and sometimes some of the users are enterprise, maybe it's a good approach. So at the end of the day, you can see for the examples, it's mostly related when we have a kind of a delay initializing the bin, some problems initializing the bin. There are other things where you can apply the lazy. For instance, maybe you cannot initialize the bin at the start because there are a lot of dependencies with other bins. There are, of course, an annotation called depends on that you can use, but maybe you don't need at that time the bin. So if that's the case, okay, just start the other bins that are the dependencies, and later, when it's necessary, you can using the lazy to make sure that everything gets initialized. So interaction with the other annotations, there are always relations. When we talk about behaving, we have always talked about scopes. So in scope, default scope, eager unless marked with lazy. Eager, it's a quite important one, because every time you see in the documentation that the initialization is eager, it means even if if you mark your component that it's as lazy, it will be initialized anyway, because the other component that depends on this, it will say it's eager, I really need the instance. So even if you mark it as lazy, the component, it will be initialized, unless you do a different thing, which is to mark the injection point also as lazy. You say the bin is lazy, but the injection point is also lazy. So don't initialize it now if you don't need it. So a proxy will be injected, and the bin will not. So that's what eager means. The prototype, always lazy by design, new bins per injection. So this will not be a problem. And then there are annotations that I didn't talk yet, and I will talk in let's say near future, which is depends on. It's when you mark, you can say a bin depends on another bin. So it's initialized after other bin, it's initialized. It's not the same as injecting. Okay, it's not that you say, okay, I will inject that for dependency. It's different. Maybe I have two systems, and one of the systems only work after another system is initialized, and you are representing these systems as bins. So you don't need to inject one system on another. You just want to make sure that when some bin that represents a system starts, the other one is already initialized. It seems the same thing, but it's not. And you can use depends on for that, but I will explain in more detail in a future video. So the lazy overrides eager in it, even if dependent lazy. So the description already said. So lazy will be the priority here. Auto-wire you can use on the same place as the auto-wire here at injection site, which defers the dependency resolution, not the bin initialization. When you put the lazy on the component, it's on the initialization. When you put on the auto-wire, it's the injection. It's the same annotation, but with different behavior. And you have the conditional. Conditional is something that you only start this bin when a specific condition. It's quite good for feature toggles, but for instance, maybe you have bins or something that say, this only works in Windows, or this only works in a Mac. And you have a lot of conditions. You even can create yourself your conditions. And again, I will create a video specifically for this, because there is a lot to say about the conditions and depends on. So this is one of example at auto-wire here, the lazy for the email service. Okay. Best practices: profile your startup to identify every bin. So the idea is, don't start with the lazy. Just make sure that you don't lazy anywhere. Now you start your application and you profile it. You say, okay, how much time it takes to load this bin? Do I really need this bin? What is the statistics for using this bin? Sometimes people forget it, but it's quite important to collect statistical and profile information, how an application is being used. I think it's the first step for you to optimize an application. Maybe there are, sometimes you have an application that 30% of the application is never used or used only after months. And this sometimes happens. That's true. So after you have that information, then you start to think, okay, maybe I can put this as a lazy one. It will remove some starting time or something like that, or any other kind of initializations that you have. So avoid lazy loading everything, only what's needed, combined with conditional property, conditional class. This conditional property, conditional class are similar annotations like this one, but they are more specific. These are for properties that you can have. This is for classes, but I will explain in a different video. But it's quite common to combine lazy with this, because you can always say this bin only exists when this is true. So you can put a lazy there, because you cannot assure that you need bin at the startup, because it's dependent of something. That's why the conditional means. So custom conditions on environment-specific bins. And document lazy bins to ensure developers are aware of startup behavior. That's quite important to at least create a kind of, I don't know, sequence diagram or something like that to explain, or maybe just list them in a bullet point. Say, okay, this bin, it's lazy, this is one lazy. But then you need a graph to say, okay, this is lazy, it depends on this one and depends on this one. But it's good to be documented so we understand why an application it's fast starting, but then at some points during the day starts to be slow, but we don't understand why. Maybe they are lazy bins being initialized. So lazy provides the delayed initialization for better performance and modularity. When you combine with conditionals and things like that, best used for heavy optional or external integration bins. External is the word because you don't control what happens outside of your application. Understand when deferred loading helps vs when it causes complexity. At some point, it's when you start to add all these annotations that I've been talking about, and there are a lot more, it's very difficult to trace all the behavior. And there is no easy way, unless you have a good documentation. But remember that Spring Boot, it's declarative. It's not sequential. It's not a script oriented. You put annotations and we expect some behavior from it. So be careful when you start to add these all annotations. Sometimes it's better to not add it and, okay, let's pay the price, 10 seconds delay here at the start, or 30 seconds, but it's just one time every 6 months or something, than to start to put lazies and complicate a lot of things, and then it will be very difficult to refactor the application or start to clean from it. So be careful with that. Architectural laziness, it's not negligence, okay, it's precision in timing. So thank you for watching these slides. I will present you now a simple example with a lazy annotation that to show the concept that we're talking about. I'll just approach the lazy annotation. In this example, I'm not putting the conditional. That will be for a near future video. So let's see. So I have our application here, and I have here the user repository where I'm adding the lazy. So if you understand, you have a REST controller that depends on user service. And the user service depends, you can see here with a lot of them, but at some point for user repository, and the repository, it's this one, depends on JDBC template and things like that. And I'm putting here lazy, meaning that only use the user repository when it's necessary, which means that's when a user service needs it tries to inject the user repository, which means that's when the user REST controller needs the user service. So I put here, and the first talk is that, okay, I put the user service lazy, the user repository is also lazy. So unless there is a call to this user controller, I don't need the user service. So let's see if that's true or not. Just take a few seconds to start. And let's see. By the way, I put some comments here, user service initialized and user repository initialized to make sure it was. And you can see that even being lazy, they were initialized. And why? Putting the lazy on the component, it's not enough. This is just saying to Spring, okay, if no one is injecting this, make it lazy, don't initialize it. But we have this REST controller, and this REST controller has an injection here, user service. So, and this injection is eager because this is a singleton. If you read the document, one of the slides that I previously said, the singleton, it's eager. Eager means that everything should be initialized because it's a singleton and needs everything on it. So it needs an instance of the user service. And since it needs a user service, Spring will say, okay, I know this is lazy, but I will create an instance for you because otherwise I cannot inject it. Okay? And it will be injected. But to inject this, I have to initialize. And to initialize, again, we have here user repository, and the user repository, again, even being lazy, it needs to be initialized. So you can all say, so what's up? Why it's not working? Because we want to defer the initialization, and we have to put here the lazy. And this way, even the singleton being eager, it will be, Spring Boot will create a proxy around this user service to make sure that it can inject something compatible with the user service. So it will inject a different instance, which is a proxy, another class that understands our class, meaning that when we call the method, any method of user service, for instance, this get user ID, this user service, it's not an instance of user service, but is an instance of the proxy. And when you call this method, we'll be calling the method of the proxy, and the method of the proxy will check, is this the real bin already initialized? Like the diagram that I showed previously? And okay, now it's not initialized. So it will initialize the user service. And when it's initialize the user service, then the user service will imply to initialize user repository, and everything will start to work. But only I do at least one call, but I have to put this lazy at injection point. So I'll restart this. Okay, let me clean this. Let's see if the initialization is here or not. Okay. Let's see. You can see that we have here user repository, but not the service. Why? Because of the same reason. The user service here needs, this is a singleton, and the singleton eagerly tries to initialize the user service. It didn't initialize the user service, but Spring Boot said, okay, maybe I need a user repository here. That's one way to do it. Another way to do it, it can be, okay, let me see. Let me see, where is the guy? We have an injection here of user repository. And I want to show you this because sometimes we think we can control all this flow, but we can't. And this is a small application. Imagine a big application. And that's one of the things when you use lazy. Be careful to document and understand all the relations. So this user repository initializer was initialized because of this guy, the password service. And of course, we can add here again a lazy to make sure that this user repository will only be initialized when it's necessary for this one. So what this means, it means that you have to mark a class as lazy here, but if the class is being used by, or this bin is using by these bins in the context of singleton, okay, probably you have to add more annotations at, let's say, the injection point. So, but we don't have here the service, as you can see. So let's clean this and let's execute a call to the services. Let's say, for instance, users. Do this, right, play. Let's see the output. You can see that now the user service is initialized, and user repository was not initialized because it was initialized previously because of this password service. So what does this mean? It's not by using the lazy annotation on the bin that works out of the box. You must understand the behavior, who depends on what, and understand the rules. If you are singleton, it's eager. What does it mean to be eager? To be eager, it means that it really requires an instance. So if you want to delay the injection point, you have to add the annotation here during the injection and not only at the component level annotation. So be careful with this. I just want to make sure you understand this. That's why I created this example, so you understand the challenge and the dangers when you're using this annotation. Because out of the box, people read and say, okay, just put lazy and it's lazy. No, depends of the scope. The behavior in Spring Boot, it's one of the most important things that you have to understand. But for you to understand the behavior, you have to understand the scopes. And the scopes can have implications in a lot of things. One of them is, for instance, the lazy. So this is what I want to show you about lazy. I hope it was useful for you. I hope you like it. Please subscribe to my channel, share with your friends, and I hope to see you in my next video. Thank you.